Okay, welcome to our first oral commentary on a poem with Mr. Johnson and Miss Bohr. We're going to talk to you today about a poem that is reasonably new to both of us called The Thought Fox by Ted Hughes. And we're going to go through the process of analysing the poem and sort of forming our own interpretation or commentary on the poem in real time. So we're going to start off with Mr. Johnson reading the poem to you.
So as you're following along, it's probably important that you make sure that you're looking at a copy of the poem, which can be found on page 51 of your 7 Centuries of Poetry in English. Now that's that really large green booklet that you purchased at the beginning of the year, and hopefully you've used a couple of times since then. The Thought Fox. I imagine this midnight moment's forest, something else is alive, beside the clock's loneliness, and this blank page where my fingers move. Through the window I see no star, something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. Two eyes serve a movement that now and again, now and now and now, sets neat prints into the snow, between trees, and warily a lame shadow lags by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come. Across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly, coming about its own business, till, with the sudden sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed.
Very nicely done, Mr. Johnson. Okay, so we thought we'd start off by talking about our first impressions of this poem and what we think it might be about and perhaps what the writer's purpose might be. So just like you would when you're doing your own commentary in the exam or in practice. So we might start perhaps with the title. That should give us a clue to how to interpret the poem. It's called The Thought Fox. What do you think that might stand for, Mr. Johnson? Or what do you think that might mean?
So I think it introduces the concept of having some sort of idea, or in this case, a thought. And the fact that the word thought is there and is hyphenated with the noun fox, what we're seeing is that Ted Hughes is linking both of those terms together for us, that he wants us to think about both terms almost in tandem in this instance. So we're led to believe that the process of thinking is linked with this animal.
Yeah, and it's one of those moments in poetry where, you know, the phrase thought fox doesn't actually make all that much sense literally, but we sort of have to think about, I guess, what it evokes and, you know, accept that there is some kind of thing called a thought fox and then think about what that might mean rather than hoping for it to actually attach itself to some literal meaning that we already have. We just have to think, what could a thought fox be?
Now, I suppose moving through the poem, at first chronologically, but of course when you're actually writing a commentary, perhaps being able to zoom in and zoom out in certain aspects of the poem is important. But for a lot of you, certainly at this beginning stage, being able to move through the poem chronologically is probably best at first.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at the first stanza, what's your first impression, Miss Bohr, of the opening lines?
Yeah, so he's imagining a midnight moment's forest. So we get the impression, first of all, that this is about something that's happening in his mind. It's something he's imagined. And there's something that enters that imagination. Something else is alive besides the clock's loneliness and the blank page. So we might imagine that there's a poet, perhaps Ted Hughes himself. We've got a figure who is using their imagination with a blank page. So we might infer from that it could be a poet. And he's described the moment that he's in as a midnight moment's forest. So perhaps it's late at night, in fact, midnight. And there's something literal or something imaginative alive beside the loneliness of the evening and the late hour and the blank page. So we've got a lonely guy sitting at midnight. Something comes to mind.
In terms of your writing, I think probably a couple of points that you're going to draw out from this stanza in particular is the mood or the tone. Now, the mood and the tone, it opens with quite a sense of stillness, and that it's in this a quiet scene, really, both in terms of the setting being midnight and also a moment's forest. That Ted Hughes wants this poem, certainly from the opening line, based within this setting. If we're going to focus specifically on the idea of loneliness and blank page, what we're seeing here is that Hughes is forcing us to consider the aspect of his character or the persona sitting by themselves for an extended period of time and perhaps just waiting for some idea or some thought to come past.
Yeah. So moving on to the second stanza, and we'll come back and do a closer reading of the devices and the impressions that particular words and phrases have made later. The speaker is looking through the window. They see no star, but something else more near is entering the loneliness. So again, we have this sense of anticipation and combined with that sense of being alone or loneliness. There are no stars. It's a quiet moment, but there's something emerging.
I think certainly with the use of language with deeper in darkness, Hughes is using it to propel sort of the narrative of this poem forward as well. And like you said, Ms. Ball, about sort of the anticipation of what is coming through the darkness and this idea of something approaching.
Mm-hmm. So just in terms as well of thinking about how to read a poem so that it makes sense to you, just make a note of the use of colons. So he starts off, I imagine this midnight moment's forest, and then there's a colon. So that suggests to us that what comes after that colon is an explanation of what is in that forest or what was in his imagination. Likewise, through the window I see no star. The colon then suggests, and then there's an explanation of what is to come. So try and use the punctuation as much as you can to help guide your understanding. Likewise, at the end of that stanza, there's another colon. Something is entering the loneliness, colon, and then that implies that what comes next is what has entered the loneliness. So I'll hand over to you there, Mr. Johnson.
So to continue on with our analysis stanza by stanza, what we see following the colon is cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig and leaf. So that is as the persona within the poem is looking through the window, this is the scene in which they're confronted with. This idea of the temperature and also in conjunction with the natural imagery of both the dark snow and the first description that we have of this fox is that its nose is touching twig and leaf, is that this fox seems to be searching for something, is probably what I'm thinking in terms of the plot or what's going on here.
Yeah. Again, we might notice that sense of anticipation that's created by the repetition that now and again, now and now and now creates. So it's quite a slow poem, I think. It doesn't lend itself to moving through the images quickly. We've got lots of pauses, monosyllabic terms. It's all quite like delicate and slow movement that we're taking. And that's echoed in the subject matter. The fox is slowly and delicately moving around wherever he is.
The concept of time, I think, is really quite important because, of course, it opens with midnight, and then the repetition of now and now and now, which we'll come back to a little bit later on, is of course used in conjunction by the poet with the concept of the ticking of the clock, which yes it is slow, but I think there's a gaining sense of almost sort of momentum or movement within the poem as it progresses.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay, so the fox is now setting neat prints into the snow between trees, and warily a lame shadow lags by stump and hollow of a body that is bold to come. So really increasing the sense of anticipation here. We've got a shadow that is sort of imitating or anticipating the body that is going to come after it, and that body is bold.
Continue on to the next stanza. Across clearing an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly concentratedly coming about its own business. This sense of approach. And of course, if we're to look back at the title and to think a little bit about the purpose and all the narrative within this poem, we see that this thought or this idea is approaching Hughes at this point in time.
And I love that length of those adverbs, brilliantly, concentratedly. It's really creating a kind of a dragged out anticipation of what's about to come. And I love the way that contrasts to with a sudden, sharp, hot stink of fox. Really hard consonant sounds there with the emergence of the fox. And it's not necessarily a really beautiful image, a hot stink of fox, not a fragrance of fox. It's sort of something vulgar and really, it's that boldness of the fox that was described before. And it's the fox has entered the dark hole of the head. So that's an ambiguous image. And we're probably going to have to look at the poem as a whole, I think, to work out what Hughes is getting at there.
So in the poem's close, the window is starless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed. there's certainly a sense of closure within this poem, which is something that not all poems, of course, lend themselves to.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have that the fox, that this thought has, of course, has entered the poet, in this case his head, and also that the window is starless still. So what we're seeing is that there's certainly a juxtaposition to in the very, let me have a look, at the start of the second stanza, where even though that the sky is still without any sort of stars, this thought is now has now sort of taken stock within his head or within his mind.
Yeah, I like that idea of the juxtaposition between the starless night and the full page. The page is printed. So we've talked about the poem so far as being literally, or apparently, about a fox that is entering an image that the poet has seen, or the speaker has seen. So now we might want to talk, I think, perhaps a little bit about the purpose, and maybe start to think about what the poet is sort of getting at. So we've had a few hints, I think, to what kind of interpretation we might make of this poem. Maybe we can point those out, hints that maybe this is not simply just about a literal fox. We want to be cautious in doing that, ascribing any kind of symbolic meaning to something literal in a poem. We want to make sure we don't do that too lightly. So let's find evidence that this is not simply a fox.
So I think the way in which the fox approaches, I think, and the setting that's established before it does, I think it really draws attention to the symbolic nature of the fox.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf, and two-eye serve of movement that now and again, is that there's this slow sense of approach.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the neat prints into the snow and between the trees, we see this progression,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, it's already been established that this writer or the character within the poem is, I believe, is suffering from some sort of writer's block,
Mm-hmm.
and that this symbolic creature, in this case the fox, is coming towards him.
Yeah, and I think we have to have that link between the art of writing and the fox itself. It's in the title. It's a thought fox. It's not just a fox. We've got that reference to the page and the imagination in the first stanza. And we've got the pages printed as the conclusion. So there has to be a connection between the fox. It has to be symbolic in some way and connected, I think, to the act of writing. So maybe we can see whether, if we think about the fox as being perhaps some form of inspiration, whether that works in the whole poem. And, if you're going to form some kind of interpretation of something as being symbolic, you have to make sure that you can carry that interpretation through, that the whole poem makes sense. If we think perhaps of the fox being inspiration, or the act of creativity, doesn't make sense. So the midnight's moments, forest, something else is alive besides the clock's loneliness and the blank page where my fingers move. So something being alive, could that be both a fox and inspiration? I think it could. Through the window he sees no star, something more near, though deeper within darkness is entering the loneliness. So again, both there could be. Maybe he's literally looking out the window and seeing a fox, but also he's finding some kind of inspiration in this moment.
I think he's attaching some thought process to the physical being that is this fox, and certainly in terms of whether or not this fox is literal, it is affecting him in a way that provides some sort of stimulus for his writing.
Yeah, and in a way, I guess it doesn't really matter whether Ted Hughes personally saw a fox or whether he just imagined it. It works either way. So setting neat prints into the snow. So I guess that could be standing for, the fox giving him the capacity to print on his page, or preparing to do that. And certainly that sense of anticipation that arises in that stanza that we talked about previously. The body that is bold to come could be representative of the idea that is emerging within him.
I think it's probably interesting to point out, particularly in this stanza where it describes the fox, shadow lags by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come, is that there's a real sense of the fox, or this thought, if we're to talk about it symbolically, is filling some sort of void for the poet. Words such as hollow and emptiness and starless and the idea of physical space, whether it be loneliness or having some sense of company, seems to be filled by the fox. And I think that's probably most interesting to point out in that stanza where a shadow lags by stumping and hollow of a body that is bold to come. So the fox or the thought, depending on your interpretation of the poem, is providing some sense of sort of filling some physical void.
Yeah, I like that idea too. And, you know, if we recognise the poet, not that we can do much without in a commentary, but we know that Ted Hughes is a pretty prolific poet, so he's certainly an artist who's had a lot of experience with that kind of moment of trying to, you know, work through the creative process. It's brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business. I think that certainly works. And then the sudden, sharp, hot stinker fox, the inspiration has come. It enters the dark hole of the head. So now that line makes sense. We can imagine a thought or an image or an inspiration has come into his mind, and now the page is printed. So the world kind of goes on around him, but the creative process has been fulfilled.
I think it's probably interesting to point out a couple of things. One is certainly in the penultimate stanza with those lists of adverbs with brilliantly and concentratedly, is to almost track Hughes's perception of this fox as it approaches all this thought fox, that it's described almost quite simply and within its physical form, what it's doing, how it looks, but certainly in that towards the poem's conclusion, with brilliantly and concentratedly, it's almost gaining some sense. The tone is quite different there. I'm not quite sure how you would probably describe it, Miss Ball, but
yeah, I don't know. I think there's a sense of him really getting caught up in sort of almost like an ecstasy of the experience. There's something really you know, almost visceral about that idea of a brilliant concentration in the process of coming about your own business. There's something really almost joyous about that moment, I think. And then that kind of vulgarity of the fox is a contrast with that. You know, maybe his poems are can be confronting, or they're not simply a beautiful thing.
And what I suppose we see certainly in terms of those two adverbs, they're brilliantly and concentratedly. They're almost at odds with the sense of emptiness in the very first stanza, I think. And what students need to be able to do in their commentaries is to be able to provide sort of these contrasts or the juxtapositions as the poem progresses, that they're not analysing them in isolation of stanza by stanza, but being able to look at the poem more broadly.
Making those connections as the poem progresses. So we've already been talking for about 15 minutes, so we maybe won't say a whole lot more about devices, but maybe we could just touch on the form of the poem, because I know that's something that my students are a little bit anxious about. You know, will they be able to recognise a form? What are they going to say about form? What are they going to say about rhyme and that kind of thing? So what do you think for this one, Mr. Johnson? What kind of things would you be saying about form and rhyme scheme and those kind of really structural elements of the poem?
Well, I think certainly with my students, it's about telling them not to stress, and then secondly, telling them to look for clues of what they do know, not stressing about what they don't. So, of course, looking at the page, what we see is that we have a regular number of lines per stanza. Now, that's not to say that I want you to list those in your commentary, that there are 4 lines in every stanza and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, or however many stanzas there are. But what we're seeing is that there is some sense of order here. And I think that's something that's worth commenting upon. Certainly, once I've had a look at the overall sort of view of the poem in that sense, in terms of structure and form, and the regular 4 lines in each of them, is then to have a look, particularly if there's any sort of rhyming pattern, where in this case there isn't. But what we do see is the use of rhythm, and certainly in terms of alliteration, that sort of builds that momentum if we're looking at sort of the structure of specific lines.
And, you know, particularly in a poem that's about poetry, we probably do want to make some comment on whether or not he has adopted a really orderly rhyme scheme or form, or whether or not he's discarded that altogether. And that brings me to the other kind of striking thing that I noticed about this poem, is that the language is really quite simple. You know, we said earlier that there's a lot of monosyllabic terms, you know, 1-syllable words. So it's not to say that it's not evocative and sophisticated, but it's not... Sorry, we just lost the screen. It's not, for example, like an invite to eternity, probably where there are a lot of words that you're not going to recognise. Now, that's probably partly because it's written in 57, but I think maybe we might ascribe some intentionality to that, especially given that this is a poem about the act of writing poetry. Maybe Hughes is saying something about what he thinks the subject matter of or the style of poetry should be, who should be reading it.
I think certainly once we're encouraging students to start considering both structure and form, punctuation is always a really good strategy to consider the way in which a poet wants you to read their poem. And in this case, you mentioned the use of colons earlier on. Think also about the way in which different stanzas conclude. I mean, we have only 2 stanzas ending in a period or ending with a full stop, and that's the first stanza where we have the poet or the writer who is struggling with ideas and thoughts and any sort of stimulus for their writing, and then of course we have at the end where the page is printed and the full stop. So what students need to be able to do is not just to list where and when full stops are used, but to focus on the how and why. Why does the first stanza end in a full stop and the final, whereas enjambment is used between the other stanzas?
I think that's great because that's an observation that any of you guys can make. You know, you can all find the full stop, and you should, I think, without too much trouble, be able to link that to the meaning of the poem. So I think our message for you, perhaps on structure, is don't be too anxious or concerned with trying to identify, is this a sonnet or a villanelle or something like that. That's not really the point. You know, it's not about device bingo. It's about actually having something to say about the way punctuation or structure or rhyme scheme or meter has been used. That's really what we're getting towards. So I don't think we'll probably today have time to actually go through and plan our response, but maybe we could both offer like a 1-sentence summary of what we think the writer's purpose is. No pressure.
Right on the spot. So the writer's purpose is to lead potential writers and the poet's audience through the process of writing, and also through the expression and the journey of not having any ideas to having sort of the approach and the celebration and the eventual sort of conclusion of the process of writing.
Yeah. And I was hoping to say something really different to show you all how you can have different interpretations of a poem, but I think I basically agree. So I'll try and just phrase it a bit differently. I think the Thought Fox is an examination of the creative process, perhaps of the beauty of that process and the pleasure that a writer can take in that moment and of anticipation of an idea, but also the kind of the pain or the vulgarity or the confrontingness of the eventual poem or idea when it comes. Again, that image of the hot, sharp stink of fox sticks with me. Okay, that's all for today, I think. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really hope that recorded. Where's the button?